This week I drew a portrait in graphite pencil, and I thought it'd be interesting to show you the process because every time I use the same 6 steps. Now let's go straight into my first step. I always draw portraits from reference photos. The main reason for this is because a portrait tends to take me at least 6 hours, and expecting someone to sit perfectly still while I draw them for 6 hours isn't really doable. So I like to either take a reference photo or I'll find a reference photo on a website like Pixabay. Now the main thing you're looking for in a reference photo is contrast. The whole key to graphite drawings looking realistic and looking interesting is the contrast. If I select an image like this one, it's not going to look very interesting when it's turned black and white, and that will show you that it also won't look very interesting when it's graphite. So I've selected this reference, which has some really good, very dark areas as well as some very bright areas. If I was taking my own photo, generally speaking, natural light is best, and I like to do it maybe stood with the window to one side so that you get a nice bright area on one side and then good shadows on the other side. Once I've got my reference, I then need to draw my outlines, and I generally use the grid method for this. This is where you put a grid on your reference photo and on your piece of paper, and you only draw what's in each individual section. Now you could freehand it, but you do need to get a really accurate sketch. If something's a little bit out, it's gonna look very, very wrong. So it's just far easier to get everything in the right place with grid method. And in some areas, like on the eye, for example, you could even put some smaller grid lines and do even smaller squares, but then larger squares on the rest of the face, just making sure that you get the crease of the eyelid definitely in the right place, or definitely get the eyebrow low enough. So now that I've got my outlines marked out, I know roughly where everything's going to go. I want to start building up some layers. So as a general rule, I tend to use 3 pencils in 3 separate layers. I want to use a hard pencil, a kind of medium pencil, and a very soft pencil. So hard pencils tend to come through a little bit lighter, whereas the soft pencils will give you those really dark areas. So I'm going to start this off with the HB pencil. And all I'm really wanting to do here is map everything out. I'm looking at where the lights are, where the darks are, and getting all of that marked in. I don't worry about any of the details whatsoever at this point though. So where there is texture on the skin, or you can see eyelashes, I don't worry about adding any of that in. I just want to block in the shapes. So you can particularly see this on the eyebrows, so I'm not worrying about putting in any of the eyebrow hairs, I'm just blocking in the key shapes. And although it looks a little bit weird right now, that's fine. Now one thing I do try and do while I'm putting down this first pencil is get everything as smooth as I can. So as I mentioned, although the skin does have some texture on it, I'm not wanting to add that, I'm just wanting a smooth base. So I generally work in small circular motions to try and get the pencil down smooth. I also don't press full force, I press relatively lightly. Something else that I think about while I'm going through this step is if there's any small hairs that will be easier to add at this point. So on the drawing that I did this week, I'm particularly looking at the white hairs that are within the man's beard. What I did was use something called an embossing tool. This is like a metal stylus that you can push into the paper. It makes very small dips into the paper. This will stop the pencil from being able to get into these sections and will therefore leave certain areas white. So I can add some of those in and then carry on shading. Note that where I'm putting down the first layer and I'm blocking in his beard section, again, I'm not really worrying about any of the texture here. I just want to put something down on the paper. Once I've marked out the whole drawing, what I want to do is blend it all together. So all I do is wrap a piece of tissue around my finger and once again work in circular motions, smoothing out everything. So by the time that I've done this, I'm left with a very smooth, blurry image, and a lot of the lighter areas have really been muddied down, but that's fine, that doesn't matter. So next up, I want to move on to a slightly softer pencil, and I tend to use something like a 3B. I want to use this to go over everything once again, although this time I am starting to think about some of the details. So I do want to be adding in things like the eyelashes, add in some of the hairs on the eyebrow, eyebrows, and I'm also wanting to fill in all of the beard hairs. I can use flicking motions with my pencil to create this. It doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to blend it all again in a second. Now you might be wondering why I keep going over the same area with slightly darker pencils. If you just went over the whole thing with just one pencil, or you went straight in with a dark pencil and just drew the whole thing in one go, you wouldn't be able to blend it, so it wouldn't look as nice and smooth. It also wouldn't look anywhere near as rich. The harder pencils aren't able to go as dark as the softer pencils, but equally the softer pencils aren't able to go as light as the harder pencils. And it does make a massive difference if you don't build them up. So once I got all of that marked in, I gave it another blend once again with the tissue, making sure that I have a clean piece of tissue this time to try and stop it from getting too muddy. And then at this point, the light areas have really been lost. So my next step is to add the light back in. Now I use erasers to do this, and I tend to use two different types. I have a putty eraser and an electric eraser. The putty eraser is great for lifting some of the graphite off the skin, so I tend to just mold it into a point and then dab it against any areas that I want to brighten up. And it doesn't make any sort of texture on there, it just lifts up a little bit of that graphite. Whereas the electric eraser, I can put quite a small eraser on the end of this, and it's very good for adding in any white hairs. Now it's not perfectly fine by any means, but it is a lot easier than if I were to try and do this with the putty eraser. So on this drawing, I went over the whole thing, adding in the light on his eye, brightening up his skin, and spending a lot of time putting in all of those beard hairs. Once I've done this, I've then committed to not blending again because I would end up losing all of these light values again. Now the last step that I do is move on to my softest pencil, and at this point I want to be adding in any final details and really deepening down any of the darkest areas. In comparison to the rest of the drawing, this is much faster, particularly helped by the fact that I've already got such a good template drawn out. If I didn't do this step, I wouldn't have those final details, and it just helps the whole drawing pop so much more. Once I've gone over the whole thing, I just use a putty eraser once again to tidy up the edges. So I select a reference, I draw my outlines, making sure that I get these as accurate as possible. I then use my hardest pencil, which is generally the HB pencil, and just draw in the lights and darks, not worrying about any of the detail, make it nice and smooth and give it a blend. I then move on to a slightly softer pencil, usually the 3B pencil, adding in now some of the details and generally deepening everything down. Once that's been blended, I then add all of the light areas back in that I've lost with my two erasers. And I then add back in the absolute darkest areas with my softest pencil, which is usually the 5B. Now these tips particularly apply to drawing portraits, but if you would like to generally improve your graphite drawing, check out this video here. Alright, happy drawing guys, and I'll see you in the next one.